Welcome to the Capital City Crew podcast. Join your hosts Jeff, Owen, Josh, and Herman as they dive deep into the game of Malifaux. Explore sophisticated strategies and creative combinations, but always remember in Malifaux, bad things happen.
Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Capital City Crew podcast. In today's episode, our main topic is talking about the master of the Honeypot Casino himself, Mr. Jacob Lynch. But before we get to that, we've got our usual 10-minute tech talk section and a few plugs. So first off, I want to give a shout out to Nick Westbrook, who has been organizing the Vassal World Cup, a series of monthly tournaments and events that have been running since November. Several of us are now playing in the April event, the April Fools 4-round tournament. So look for an episode coming probably in early May where we recap our experience in the tournament, how it went, whether we won or lost, and just generally talking about the tournament. And stay tuned if you are looking for online games for a May event. It hasn't been announced yet, but I believe one should be coming. So again, kudos to Nick for keeping the torch going on Vassal events and making it possible to play with people all over the world. I'm playing with someone from Sweden this weekend, and there's 88 players this round. So follow the coverage on Facebook and on the weird forums. And speaking of the Vassal World Cup event, with us in studio today is Landon Sheehan, who is currently in fourth place in the tournament after round one, but is also an expert and big fan of Jacob Lynch. Welcome, Landon.
Thanks. It's good to be here. I do have to say I do love getting some Lynch games in whenever I can sneak it in.
So tell us how long have you been playing Malifaux? How'd you get into the game?
I've been playing Malifaux from around Wave 4 of 2nd Edition. I actually got into the game by meeting Kyle, aka Coyote himself, when I was studying out in college, and he was pushing a few miniatures around. And at that point, it looked cool enough to buy in. So that shortly thereafter, I ended up moving actually and settling in with the meta in Mount Prospect, and from there it just kind of grew.
That's awesome. Well, we're always excited to chat with folks from across the country, and look forward to eventually being able to play with you in person. And so you had as our guest today, you had a 10-minute tech talk pick for us this week. You want to tell us about that? Who was your pick?
My pick would be the Wenudo, the Great Flaming Firewheel of 10 Thunders. He doesn't have a keyword home of himself, but he does a couple of really key things that the faction enjoys to have. Number one being he's freaking fast. So he's move 7, he's got Mobile Warrior, and he has essentially like a Baby McCabe ability where he can move through enemies and force them to take move duels. But on top of that, the real cool thing he does is that when he makes a melee attack, he also pushes 5 in any direction. So there's a couple of cool things that you take him for. Firstly, as we discussed, he goes very fast, and he can use your own models to attack to get even more distance. So on, say, a turn you want to get from one ley line to the other, you can charge him 7, make a melee attack against one of your own guys, relent for an extra 5, and then walk for another 7 to do a whole whopping 19 inches of movement. Actually up to 22 if you hit a trigger. And at that point in time, you can essentially start doing laps around the board with all that movement. So ley lines is a big place where he's great. But he also has the ability to do very precise amounts of condition-based damage, which makes him an excellent pick for hidden martyrs as well. As his move duel we mentioned does 1 point of damage and 1 burning, and he's got a bonus action on the back of his card that reduces burning by 1 in a 3-inch pulse to do 1 point of damage. So combined with his min of 2 and the large amount of burning he puts out, you can scalpel a model down to 1 and let it die to burning if you're sussing out a hidden martyrs target, which can be really game deciding in some close games.
That Hidden Martyrs tech, especially, that's really smart. And I think in general, conditions like burning and poison are not necessarily overlooked, but maybe underutilized when Hidden Martyrs is in the pool. So, just a general tip for folks: if you have that in your mission pool and you have access to either of those damaging conditions, definitely worth taking a look. I've mostly seen Juan Yudo in the context of either being summoned off of Minakure or being hired out of faction into a Reva list. How often do you just straight up hire Juan Yudo?
I don't think I've played a game of Corrupted Leylines without this model, to be completely honest. He's like where I start every Corrupted Leylines list. Sometimes he'll just come into my McCabe lists because he's height 2, so you can use Ride With Me on him. And he synergizes pretty well if you either get staggered out since he attacks move and has his move duels, or just as another thing to go in afterwards, because this guy can be a real blender at stat 6 attacking move with all the burning and damage he puts out. Those are the two main situations, and sometimes, like I said, I'll tech him in for Martyrs.
Now, how about the rest of y'all? Have you had any experiences with Juan Yudo, either on the receiving end or the playing end?
Yeah, I've been on the receiving end of him before. I was playing a Dreamer into, ironically enough, Lynch matchup, and he had hired in Juan Yudo to run Symbols of Authority. And that little sucker was fast. Fortunately, Chompy Bits was faster. But he got across the table, no problems. It was really impressive and kind of a little scary. I had some jealousy, truth be told.
I've taken the Juan Yudo in Reva Cruz primarily. He is delightfully difficult to pin down between Trample and Mobile Warrior. You just can't stop him from moving if he really wants to.
So I've used Juan Yudo in 10 Thunders and with Reva, both as hires. And the mobility that you're getting, like a lot of people don't see it at first glance, but he can move 7 inches and then charge another 7 inches. And he's stat 6 against a model's move, and you can usually force that off. And if you manage to have a mask there, he can move another 8 inches. So you're looking at 14 plus 8, and he can move that far in a turn. That's pretty phenomenal, and it's not something that people should overlook.
Right, yeah, especially with that whole symbols tech, as you were mentioned earlier in the one game. To understand that if you have a symbol within essentially, 7 plus 5 plus another 3, 15 inches of this guy, he can potentially push all the way out there and grab it. Like, 15 inches is an absurd range for being able to move and interact.
And he gets to ignore models along the way while he's doing it, which makes things even better. So
and he's unimpeded, so he ignores Severe on the way too.
Yeah, the only thing you need to watch out for with Juan Yudo is he's very fragile. I know that when I see him on the board, I try to take him off pretty quickly because he's going to be rolling around killing people.
That is certainly his one downside. You kind of have to keep him hidden until it's time for his blender to go off or whatever scheming you need done.
There we go. If you listeners, if you use Juan Yudo or face Juan Yudo in an upcoming game, let us know. Give us a comment on this episode, and we'd love to hear about it. And if you haven't tried out Juan Yudo, definitely give him a look. For all the reasons we just covered, it's a great tech piece and addition in a lot of missions. All right, so we're gonna go to a quick break, and when we get back, we're gonna dive right into our Jacob Lynch Honeypot deep dive. So stick with us, and we'll be right back.
All right, welcome back. So we again have Landon here, and let's talk a little bit about Lynch. What about him stands out to you from all these other masters? What situations are you looking to take Lynch into? What do you think makes him special and unique?
So the reason why I like to hire Lynch in a competitive sense isn't necessarily the raw power level that you get from some of the other 10 Thunders masters on the market right now, but rather the unique ability he brings to the faction, which actually comes from his totem, not the master, which is Obey. And so the ability to actually have an Obey in faction is pretty big for, if you don't know what Obeys do, the answer is a whole hell of a lot. And what makes his Obey unique is that he can actually get it at a plus flip. So a lot of Obey Masters have the weakness of, if you put him on concealment, it gets very inefficient to actually start taking those actions. Because when you need to, on your Zoraida, take a focus and then an Obey or start spending stones, that really sucks. But with the unique crew mechanic that they have known as Brilliance, you can actually remove those tokens from enemies to get to either a positive or a straight flip on your Obeys, which comes in very handy. So that's usually when I think, in a competitive sense, I want to play Lynch this game, when Obeys are good.
So definitely everybody wants to be Zoraida. I mean, come on, let's hands down. She's just a sexy beast. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that you immediately pivoted to the Hungering Darkness and Obey, and that's almost the opposite of what everyone kind of looks at when they first see this interaction. Because you have Lynch, he's got his little pop gun, and he can use that to place the Hungering Darkness like right into the middle of the crew, and kind of similar to Dreamer and Lone Chompy, but it's kind of put this big melee guy who's kind of hard to take down. When do you kind of look at Hungering Darkness as this Obey critter versus a beat stick?
So the lovely part is you can do both. Usually, as you said, you'll want to use Lynch's Derringer with a trigger to place the Hungering Darkness up the board to minimize the amount of walk actions he takes. But the nice thing about Huggy is you get to look at him when it's his activation and say, there's like a checklist of things you can do, right? And so like number one on the checklist is, can I take an Obey that will score me points or deny me points? Somewhere around down the checklist, you'll look and you'll see, is there something I can put in a severe of anywhere from 6 to 8, since he has crit strike on his attack, to go ahead and kill, because that can be a pretty powerful play as well. And that's really when you're going to want to use them in melee, is when there's a good focus spike you can get. Because there's not all too many models in the game that can reliably hit something for 8 points of damage in one attack. Huggy happens to be one of them. But for the most part, Obey is where you're going to really get a lot of mileage out of him, because it gives him a lot of reach. It has a built-in trigger to put out Brilliance, which is an important thing for the crew to get in general, whether on your friendly models or on enemy models, because you can use it both ways. And at a plus flip against Willpower, it's very often pretty easy to land that.
So when you are settling on your Obeys, do you find that they kind of fall into a pattern where in the early game you're obeying your own models, in the late game you're obeying your opponent's models? Are there specific situations that you're looking for? Is there anything in general that would help someone new coming to this crew to be like, I can recognize this opportunity to use Obey in this manner?
So some of the easy to figure out situations, I would say, for Obey is if you are playing a strategy where it's something like Corrupted Ley Lines and he has to have his guy sitting on the ley line at the end of the turn. If he leaves his guy on the ley line activated, you can go, okay, that's an easy point to just get for an Obey, right? So you'll take that with plus flip. Or if you see an enemy model with something like Focus or a resource you want to take away from them, that's a pretty easy Obey target right there. I think the last game I played Lynch, someone had the Intrepid Emissary with Focus sitting next to an Operative. And so I thought, getting rid of that Focus seems pretty good on this 246 model. And usually they'll spend the Focus on the flip against the Obey. So even if you fail the Obey, you've still gotten rid of a resource just for trying. And if they don't do that, well, then when you win, you get to take a focused attack at a better damage track. And so that's just all gravy, no matter you win or lose. So those are two pretty cut and dry examples of when Obey is great.
So you've talked a lot about the master in the crew, Huggy. What about his totem, Jacob Lynch?
Right. His totem, Jacob Lynch, is pretty good for getting out Brilliance on your own guys and can put it out to enemies. One of the real nice ways he does that is his bonus action. This round's on me. For a mighty 4 of anything, which, as we'll probably get into later, is trivial for this crew to get. You get to put out a pulse of 6 inches where enemies have to take a TN14 willpower duel or gain a Brilliance token. The important part is that there's 2 triggers on this. One's built in, where you get to give your own models within the set range a Brilliance token, and they also heal 1. The other one's not built in, but for a mask, enemy models within range that have 3 or more Brilliance tokens gain stunned. It doesn't matter whether they pass the willpower duel beforehand. If you take the action and they have 3 Brilliance tokens, they're stunned, no questions asked. And that can be incredibly powerful in some matchups.
6 inches huge for just like,
God,
and you're all stunned.
Yeah.
Man.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
Well, I just want to go back and mention because I love obeys. Another other than using the focus, if you have a rider that you're going against, I love obeying a rider to charge into something or use one of his abilities, and then just being like, "I'm using all of your tokens." It's like, well, I can only get 2 rams. Doesn't matter. I'm using all of your tokens.
Well, the thing about that is there is absolutely no scenario in which you should ever be able to spend the tokens, as the rider is allowed to put his tokens into the failed willpower duel before resolving the duel, as it's when you declare triggers. So he knows whether he's won or lost when he puts the crows in. Or, sorry, I play against a lot of dead rider, whatever the suit is.
It's true, and you know what? These are some great tips of a lot of people don't even think like I'm going to use my focus on this attack or I'm going to use all of my suits just to get rid of them so you can't use them against me. Like that's good counterattack.
Yeah, if you are struggling against obeys, remember to use your resources before the obey hits. Good advice.
So beyond just the obey, so you've mentioned brilliance a couple times. I know that's a key aspect of sort of the whole crew. It was big in second edition, continues in third. Can you talk to us a little bit about like what is brilliance? What does it do for the crew? Why is it good for you and bad for me?
So brilliance is the manifestation of one of my favorite changes from second edition to third edition, in that it's not a condition anymore; it's a token. And by itself, this brilliance token, either on my model or on your model, doesn't do anything in particular. It's simply a counter. Um, but when Lynch goes, he can turn that brilliance into damage with one of his attack actions, or if you have too much of it, you get stunned, as we mentioned. Huggy can take brilliance off of either friendly or enemy models, depending on what he's targeting with his attacks. Get plus flips. Huggy also sucks it up for a bunch of healing and some nasty pulses of slow. And then the rest of the crew has some interactions with it. But the big things are it makes it harder to resist Tannen's boring conversation, which is a bubble of you don't get to play the game, which plays into the crew's game plan uh, overall. The nuke on Lynch, and then the plus flips from Huggy. As far as what it's doing on my models, it makes my models easier to obey if I need Huggy to hit his TNs, since you need an 8 for his obey normally. And while that's not a big deal for the reason of the other crew special ability, it's still nice to be able to just flip it and not cheat it. And then I think a couple of other models use it as a resource, as well as your summons need brilliance tokens to live.
Well, I mean, one thing is you can cancel interacts, which has been fairly huge in my games against him with Beckoners.
You know, it's funny you say that. I know that ability exists, and I declare it every time I use a Beckoner, but I've yet to have it come up in, I think, any of my Lynch games, really.
So you said something there that essentially kind of wild when you consider what usually stands out for masters. We've been talking about Huggy plus Lynch uh, for several minutes now, and you just sort of offhandedly mentioned, oh yeah, and he can summon things. Like usually, summoning is like this is what you do. Like this is why you have this particular master. I gather that's not the focus for Lynch, at least Lynch as you play it. Talk to us about that. Like when is summoning happening? Is that integral to the game plan or not?
So Lynch has a very odd summon in that it's tied to his range 6 willpower attack, which does damage to an enemy equal to the number of brilliance tokens they have onto them, to a maximum of 5. That very low number of 5. And if you kill the target with the attack, you get to summon a Honeypot minion with an upgrade attached to it, equal to or lower than the cost of brilliance tokens the model had when it was killed. Usually that means you're getting something that costs less than 5. But if for some reason you have a model that has an incredible amount of brilliance tokens, you can get an illuminated at 7. What this really means is usually get a relatively mediocre but still helpful model known as the depleted. Its ability list is very short, and it's essentially just a body, but bodies are still useful regardless of how immobile or little impact they have as far as during their own activation. They still force things like disengages or just take up space so that you have to walk around them. But they're definitely not something you're relying on as far as whether or not they're going to make or break your game.
They're small exploding tar pits.
The other option you sometimes see is summoning in a Beckoner, but Beckoners, for the same reason, aren't all that great as a summon, because you usually want them for their beginning of game abilities or their static abilities on the board, and they're pretty easy to get rid of at 5 wounds, with their only real defensive tech being a minus flip. Sometimes.
The depleted strike me as being kind of like the abominations in a Leviticus crew. Like you
That's
might
a good
get
comparison.
them. They're not integral to the game plan. They're sort of ancillary summons that are kind of crappy. Ironically, my abomination models are converted depleted models because I won some depleted in a tournament before I started playing Thunders.
No, the abominations are, I would say, are quite a bit better than the depleted because they just do passive damage to everything around them. And if I'm not correct, don't they have the anti-healing aura as well?
They do. They do have the
And
anti-healing.
yeah, so they're significantly
yes.
better. Yeah, and so the depleted are literally like, I'm there. I try to keep you from walking places. I'm a little bit more like they're not even difficult to kill. It's just they explode to do 2 damage, and bro, it's like
the last thing that I should mention is that your summon upgrade gives them a useful ability, which is at the end of their activation, they lose a brilliance token, and everything within a certain distance, I believe 2 inches, gains a brilliance token.
Yeah, it's 2.
Sorry, only enemy models gain the brilliance token, but it's a way to give out brilliance without any duels, which is helpful. But by the point that you usually have one, you've already killed one of the more important models that you've been stacking brilliance on. So it gets somewhere into the win more territory, but in a game where diff matters, winning more matters.
So there's one other keyword ability that shows up on a lot of the models in the Honeypot keyword, and that's rig the deck. It shows up with different values, like rig the deck 2 on Lynch. I think there's a rig the deck 3 on someone. Can you talk us through, for those who aren't familiar with it, what is rig the deck? Why does everyone have it? Is it something that you use a lot?
Rig the deck is an ability that happens at the start of their activation that ties into their theme as operating and running the Honeypot Casino. What they get to do is they get to look at a number of the cards from the top of their deck and draw them into their hand and replace the top of the deck with a card from their hand instead, equal to the number on it. So Lynch himself has, say, Rig the Deck 2. You get to take 2 cards from the top, put 2 cards back. If that doesn't already sound busted, I can walk you through some reasons why that's really good. Unlike something like Intuition, where you just get to know what's coming, with Rig the Deck, you get to put your own cards back. So TNs, like the 4 on Lynch, you're almost always going to hit because you get to pick any of the, if you've got a full hand, 8 cards in your hand to flip for that. So you're never going to overflip a TN, and you're pretty much guaranteed to never have to cheat it so long as you're on a model that has Rig the Deck. But then we get into some of the cheekier things you can do with it, like say when you are flipping an attack defense on your own models, the rulebook does not tell you that you have to flip for the attacking model first. So if it's something like a lure on your Beckoner, which has Rig the Deck 1, you see the top card, you see that you don't have any 6s that you want to put in for the lure on your Beckoner. Instead of just saying, oh, I can't lure my guy, I don't have a 6 I want to use, what you can do is you can put a low card back, declare that you're flipping for the defender first, and then flip a second card off the top of your deck for the lure and hope to hit a 6 or better. And that's just the start of examples of how this ability is great.
sneaky tech.
Well, it can help you, I imagine, too, like if you know you're going to be on a negative, you could put 2 cards back that are going to be high. Or
yeah, if you need to take a neg flip attack and you are taking on a pretty low stat model, you can just say, okay, I'll put 2 10s back. You know, you don't go down any cards in your hand. You've got those 2 cards that you can use later for other tricks. Like if any card in your hand is useful in Lynch, because it'll inevitably hit a TN or be something you can use to draw a better card later.
Cool. Well, I'm more excited about Lynch than I was when I started. So good stuff. Why don't we take a quick break, and when we get back, we can talk about kind of what your list building plan is beyond Lynch and Huggy, obviously. Who's your core crew, and then who some of your out of keyword hackers are. So stick with us. We'll be right back.
Hello. Do you like our podcast and want to ensure that it continues to run? Maybe you want to hear our outtakes on unedited footage. Or perhaps you're just flush with cash and you like being generous. Either way, we've set up a Patreon just for you. If you like us, please consider donating. Our Patreon can be located in the show notes. If not, we're all pretty sure that it's Herman's fault. Either way, if you like our show, go ahead and leave us a comment. Thanks.
All right, welcome back, folks. So we've heard why secretly obey is the secret sauce of the Honeypot, surprising me greatly. So we're going to focus next on what does the typical crew look like? What are the different styles of Lynch? Who is in those styles? Who are the out of keyword models? So take it away, Landon. What are your approaches?
Yeah. So the easiest place to start would probably be the crew that everyone thinks of when they hear Lynch. And in that sort of style, you're playing a bubble, which is pretty much impassable to your opponent. You'll lure them into it, and then every time they cheat, they're going to be taking brilliance, they're going to be taking damage, they're going to be taking another damage, and they're probably also going to be discarding a card. And if it doesn't sound gross, I mean, think about it. You're trying to cheat. You're dropping 2 cards. You're taking 2 damage. You're getting a brilliance, which also translates to bad stuff. Like that. That kills most models, no matter what you are. I don't care how much defensive tech you have. And then on top of that, you might have an out of keyword pick that puts you on minus flips to all those willpower duels. And the thing that really fuels this are a handful of models. You've got Mr. Tannen, who for a bonus action can put up boring conversation, which a lot of models in the game have, but his caveat is he's got a trigger on it for a crow, which you'll hopefully have due to rig the deck off of a couple of activations, where you increase the TN, which is normally a 10, by 1 for every brilliance token you have. And so that just applies for the whole turn after you throw it up, and it starts to get really gross if you've got, say, like a Kabuki Warrior, which is an out of keyword pick you can take that puts anything within 2 of it at a neg flip on willpower duels. So if you've got to make like a TN12, TN13 willpower duel every time you want to do anything other than walk, and you're on an egg flip, you don't usually get to do anything than walk. So that's the big part of the bubble, is having Mr. Tannen there.
I will. Sorry, since you're talking about Lynch's bubble, there is one thing that I've encountered that is a problem with the bubble in general, and that's, as you were saying, you have to put up Tannen's boring conversation towards the beginning of the turn to get the bubble going, but then you knock off Tannen's manipulative. How do you get around that?
Absolutely, you are correct. The first answer to that is you only hire the bubble sort of crew when you can predict what your opponent's going to bring, in that it's going to not be able to meaningfully interact with Tannen from outside of 6. The second step of that process is taking models with long engagement ranges, like a Kabuki Warrior, or using Huggy and Shadow Emissary, which I'll talk about later, to try and form this sort of like meat wall that doesn't stop them from seeing Tannen, but stops them from fighting Tannen. And at that point, you get to comfortably take, your first or second activation to actually activate Tannen and throw the bubble up.
So you take them against Resurrectionists and Neverborn, who have to close in on you as opposed to shooting you from far away.
Exactly. I wouldn't hire Tannen in a Lynch list probably if it was against like Guild or Outcast or anyone who's iconically got long range guns. Some people will tell you they like to just stick the stealth upgrade on him for that, but my rationale against that to you would be, if your opponent can interact with you from outside of 6, which is the reason you're taking the upgrade, they can still do everything to the rest of your list besides Tannen once you put the upgrade on him, and they don't need to come into your bubble at all. So you're paying 8 stones for something that's essentially an extra, don't do that thing you already weren't intending to do.
So would you say in the bubble brick list, Tannen is the linchpin?
That was
He's
bad.
certainly important, but when he dies, your list doesn't fall apart. But I appreciate the pun.
I'm gonna after that joke, I'm gonna put in that wah wah sound just when in editing. I want you to know that.
Sorry, I couldn't resist
That
it.
sounds beautiful.
So what's what? All right. So what's style number 2?
So style number 2 is probably the most common style that I'll run Lynch if I come to a tournament and like, I'm going to play Lynch today. And that's where I just hire 2 from the Shadow Samurai and put them in your face. And essentially use them as a launching point to send Huggy up the board. So I'll take 2 from the Shadow Samurai. I'll put them within 12 of your deployment zone or however to snipe off a few key squishy pieces. And then later when I'm unpacking with Lynch and I'm done shaking everybody's hands, I'll take a walk and I'll shoot one of my samurai to pop the Huggy up next to wherever needs help. And generally this goes one of 2 ways. Either my opponents have engaged the samurai and Huggy now just like eats whatever you engage the samurai with his focus hit. Or you haven't engaged the samurai and Huggy just starts obeying your stuff back to your deployment zone to mess with you. And so that style offers a lot of control over just being able to tell your opponent they're not allowed to be on certain sections of the board. And also just offers a lot of damage and aggression in the early turns.
And this harkens back to the whole his samurai tech that he's talking about right now. The reason why it probably works better with a Lynch is because of Rig the Deck. You can do a throwaway type activation with a Beckoner or something in the beginning. Where I don't know if Beckoners have Rig the Deck, but I think they do. Where
They do.
you can start stacking stuff up, so you know when that samurai activates, you're going to get some good cards going in, and that's a pretty good tactic there. Dirty 10 Thunders with their ninja samurais that teleport up the board.
Exactly. You can either go early or late with them depending on what your opponent's offering you and how your hand looks. To the point where you're either going with a stacked hand full of like, your 13 of rams you need to blast, or you just kind of wait for them to send anyone out into the danger zone, and then, that's when you've got the great hand.
And heaven forbid they actually get into melee with you with your armor 2, also really good in melee monster. With 10 Thunders, man.
Yeah, and with Honeypot, they're not expecting any armor just on your keyword models. So if they're teching for armor and you don't bring the samurai, then you're kind of okay with that. And if they tech for armor and you do have samurai, you still get to kind of play around that and use Huggy to try and keep those specific pieces away from the danger zone. So they scratch each other's back.
So one thing I kind of wanted to circle back to the non-samurai, the more interesting build, where you're kind of building this meat bubble. What does that look like for setting up for deployment? What does that look like for your turn 1? What does that look like so that you're not stepping on all your own models?
Sure. So typically with the unpack, Tannen has a really key ability here where every time you gain a brilliance token, once per activation, you get to scoot something too. And so with Lynch, you have a lot of ways to hand out brilliance to your own models. His own activation, he can take a handshake, which is a range 1 melee attack that gives the model whose hand you shake 2 brilliance tokens. And then you do not have to, reveal the top card of your deck and the target's deck and do some damage. But you don't have to do that if it's a friendly. So you end up just handing out some brilliance tokens, and there's a trigger on it to push either Lynch or the target 3 inches. So essentially you get to charge Lynch, shake someone's hand, and shunt them 5 inches up the board. Usually doing this to like a Beckoner, who benefits from the brilliance tokens and then also can lure your other models up the board while giving them brilliance tokens with her trigger built into the lure, or repositioning on her lure to get into a better position because that's also built in. Having 2 built-in triggers is pretty cool. But the unpack, that's how you get the bubble up the board, is you start using the extra 2 inches of movement from Tannen, plus the Beckoner's lures, plus Lynch's handshakes to advance quicker up the board than your opponent can and get set up in the center so that if they have to come to there to score, they start having a hard time.
And as a completely side note here, because Herman mentioned meat bubble, if you go to Google and do an image search on that, I'm not recommending it, but you get some pretty interesting results.
No,
that's a terrible. Don't do that. No,
don't suggest that.
Why, John?
I just assumed it'd be pictures of Landon playing.
Suddenly we have like 120 of our podcast listeners that instantly made Meat Bubble top of Google's search list.
That would be wild.
This is how you get
They're all
demonetized.
different pictures too.
Yeah. So on that disgusting note,
Not falling for this trap.
no, definitely not. No, but that's a good point though about the unpack, because like bubble crews, I find them fun. I don't know, different people
You mean
like
Meat Bubble
them.
Cruise?
Yeah,
God
meat
damn
bubble
it.
crews. Yeah, yeah. Goodbye brick. Hello meat bubble. But yeah, so when you're playing a meat bubble crew, the unpack and movement of the bubble is often the hardest part, unless you have some kind of special trick to move things around. Is there anything around the activation order of that you typically go with to avoid your guys running into each other and bunching up?
So Lynch going relatively early in the turn helps a lot, and Huggy going relatively late in the turn also tends to help. The reason for that being is that Lynch firstly gets to do the rig the deck, and you'll go later with him if you don't have low mass that you want to pitch for his trigger. But he gets to see 2 new cards to try and help you figure out what you want to do with your unpack. He gets to trigger Tannen's Brilliance so that you can scoot problematic models into the right spot right off the bat with his pulse. And then you get to start pushing him around with your here and there trigger on the handshake if you have the masks, which ideally you do. And then having the Beckoner go out and just lure the rest of your problem pieces that might be blocking your stuff for the next sort of action helps a lot as well, because once you've started to break out from your deployment zone, you get a lot more options.
So is the mobility that this provides sufficient to compensate for, say, corner deployment for a bubble crew?
I would say yes, usually. It depends on how far you need to go, but when you get to essentially take your 2 key pieces and just put them 5 to 7 inches up the board for essentially a 5-stone model, just having your Beckoner take the 2 lures, that usually doesn't really take a lot of cards because you've got Rig the Deck. So that's the other downside you usually get to these movement-based things. It starts looking pretty good. And on top of that, you've also got another model that I like to take, usually in more of the third and second kind of style of list, but sometimes makes it into the first, Kitty Dumont, who has an additional movement trick that helps you get out of your deployment zone with reaching tendrils, which is a gun that just pushes something 6.
I'm glad you're bringing up these movement tricks because I will say one of the big counters to, as Herman has dubbed, the meat bubble type crews is your opponent has some control over that. They can be like, I'm not going in there. Like, you can do your setup all you want. I'm not going to take anything that I consider important into that grouping. But Lynch is in a unique place where he has a lot of movement shenanigans between the Beckoner and Kitty, where you can be like, you don't have a choice. I'm going to bring one of your models in, and I choose which one it's going to be. So he kind of gets around that counter tech.
Exactly. And one of the other models I very frequently will take into Lynch, the Shadow Emissary, also has the heave trigger, where you get another one of those, you don't get to say you're coming in here type effects, where you just place them in.
All right, so we heard. I'm not sure if I'm tracking this correctly. We heard the meat bubble, and we heard the samurai up the board, sneaky ninja. What was the third list?
So the third list is a bit less uniform than the other two, but it's essentially what I would say is the I wanted and obey this game list soup, where you're taking Lynch because he comes with Huggy. And then you just take a bunch of models that are good at the strategy and schemes. So like this, in an example, you'd be playing like Corrupted Ley Lines. You'll take like an Emissary. You'll take a Waynudo because that model's amazing. And then just whatever tech pieces you might want. Like I think in my last game, I took a Kabuki Warrior because negative to willpowers are nice. But you're not aiming to sit in a bubble. You're aiming to score points and then just leverage Huggy's Obey. And if Lynch gets Brilliance tokens out and kills things, that's cool. But you're not playing a Brilliance-centric crew like you would be in the bubble style or in like the samurai style per se, where you're trying to kill things. You're more or less leveraging the movement tricks end of it rather than the bubble end of it.
I'm curious, when you're playing this obey type style, have you ever gone against a opponent Lynch in the mirror match? Because it sounds like in the obey style, you're putting brilliance on your own guys to make obeys easier, but that could be detrimental in that matchup.
I've played the mirror twice. It was not a great fun time, as Huggy is just a monster in that matchup. For both sides, as you don't get a choice for the most part if any of your keyword models come in with brilliance. So in the mirror, you try and take as little keyword as possible. It's not a great time. I wouldn't recommend it. But yes, putting brilliance tokens on your own guys in the mirror is not very helpful. Would not recommend.
So other than the Juan Yudo, are there any other? You said this is more of kind of a good stuff, all-starry type list. Are there any other models that particularly stand out when you can add some out of activation AP?
Yeah, I would say the always takes in the third style would probably be Kitty, the Shadow Emissary, and then just whatever comes to mind. It's a very open list at that point, so it's hard to say exactly what I'd take. Usually some sort of model from the Shadows, probably. But really, you're just probably taking that, a Beckoner, and then just trying to make sure you can score points. It's going to depend what the strategy is. But if I'm declaring a list like that, it's probably because I've read that I want an obey into that faction or for that strategy. So, for example, against something like Dashel, where your primary way to summon is only protected by protected, answering countenance, both abilities that only work against enemies, that's where I might say, I'm just going to declare Lynch into this because I want an obey for this matchup and I don't care what else I'm hiring. And so you're just kind of building for the pool and for the crew at that point in time rather than having some sort of set game plan yourself.
That really
Which is
hurts
something
my soul.
Thunders excels at.
Poor Dashel. All he does is get dumped on.
It should hurt you. Oh my god, Dashel is like really good right now. Shut up.
Bald is beautiful.
So I hear you talking about a lot of these models in the Lynch crew, and obviously we've mentioned depleted. Everyone knows illuminated do. They're just damage fed dealers. There are two models that I'm curious about. One I've seen since Herman mentioned Bald is beautiful. Tannen's bodyguard of Mr. Graves. I've seen him dropped more often than not in Lynch crews, and I want your thoughts on him. But I'm curious why we haven't talked about Gwyneth yet. I had usually included her because I felt like she was actually a good model. What are your thoughts?
So I'm on the anti-Gwyneth team. There's not very many of us, but to me she has a lot of overlap with the Shadow Emissary, except she's a far more parasitic model that ironically doesn't play very well into your game plan. So here's the good stuff she does. She has the same aura that Beckoners have, which says if a model cheats within 6 of you, they get a Brilliance token. Unfortunately, it's exactly the same, so if you already have a Beckoner within 6, there's no extra benefit. So that's detriment number 1 of me. I'm already probably hiring a Beckoner because I like what they do for movement, and her best ability on the front of card has some overlap. She's got Rig the Deck 3, which is really nice because you get to look at a bunch of cards. That's the other real good thing that she does. And then the rest of it's some defensive tech, which situationally works, situationally doesn't. I'm not in love with Luck Thief as an ability.
Well, here's a side question to that then. Outside of Lynch, would you take her into a different master, a different keyword?
Absolutely never. She's far too parasitic for me to run most of the time in the keyword, and she is not getting any better when you remove Brilliance from the equation.
Well, it's worth a try for her.
Yeah, and just for listeners who might not be familiar with the term parasitic, I'm assuming you're meaning that it really relies on the synergies with other models.
Yes, so to really explain a solid concrete example of what I mean when I call her a parasitic model is her basic attack action, Card Shark. Target suffers 1, 2, 3 damage, plus 1 per Brilliance token the target has on it to a maximum of 2. In other words, her main attack for this 9-stone model is going to be a 1, 2, 3 attack unless you already have Brilliance on the target. So she is relying on the actions of other models to get these Brilliance tokens out so that her own turn can be better. And so the more Brilliance you remove from the crew, the worse this model gets. She has that parasitic interaction where she needs a host activation to set her up. And while she can put out some brilliance by herself, the trigger on Card Shark is not only after resolving, it's not built in. So you would have to hit them with a min 1 attack first to get brilliance out with that. Or you could shoot them with your Derringer, which is range 8 and ignores nothing, to get the built-in brilliance tokens. But if I'm paying 9 stones for a model, I'm kind of hoping for more than a 2, 3, 4 from 8 inches that does nothing, but put a token out and ignores nothing. The one thing I will have to plug about the Derringer, though, and the reason why she makes some of my lists some of the time, is that it has drawn out secrets, which lets you drop a scheme marker from 8 inches away, especially if you're relenting to shoot your own guys, just putting the books in. You usually don't have to stone because you've rigged the deck 3, so you know it's coming off the top. So there is some good stuff there, and she does make some of my lists.
Yeah, I was going to mention the drawn out secret trigger, but the other thing I've seen her used for is the come play at my table, where she does the pulse out, and usually if she can get into the towards the upper part of a crew, she does that, and you have to make the willpower duel, and some of the models will have brilliance, so some of them might be on negatives, but if they cheat to try to avoid being pulled closer to you, potentially into the bubble, they get a brilliance token because they cheated because they're within 6 inches of Gwyneth. So that's the other major thing I've seen people use her for.
So here's where I start to get into this is where I find this model overlaps a lot with the Shadow Emissary, where if I'm trying to get people to come into my bubble, come play at my table isn't a long enough range from outside my bubble that it's really going to put things that weren't already close enough anyways inside. Then we get to the point where she's very slow. It's very hard to get her into the enemy crew to begin with without a lot of outside help. She's move 5. She has no extra ways to move herself. She has nothing to avoid terrain. So she's very slow. She doesn't have a lot of range on her ability to grab things out into your bubble. And then on top of that, her damage is not great. And the other thing that she does really well is draw cards. But the Shadow Emissary also lets you re-rack and get even with your opponent. So I find that most of her advantages come with a slightly more attractive package in the Shadow Emissary, who also brings more synergy into the crew that maybe isn't quite as visible.
And that makes sense. But I will tell you from somebody that's been playing Explorer Society for the last year exclusively, when somebody says she's only walk 5, so she's slow, it hurts. It hurts me deep.
Explorers has other tricks, but yeah, I hear you.
And so what about, as Jeff alluded, what about Mr. Graves, who you also haven't mentioned much?
So someone said they see him dropped a lot, and I wonder if that means dropped as in put on the table or dropped as in this guy comes nowhere near my list ever, because
So
I don't
I have to say that Bald is only beautiful in Guild.
I see him dropped out of the list more often than any other model.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I've ever hired him willingly. No, that's a lie. I hired him once in the Dreamer matchup and regretted it because this model is slow, and it's going to sound really sad, but he punishes you for playing badly. So one of the things he has that really ties into that is he has Black Blood. So if you accidentally put Graves next to your own models, you take damage whenever they hit Graves. Graves is not quite phenomenally on defense. He's defense 5 with hard to kill as his defensive feature. But the reason why you might also make the mistake of putting him too close is he has Bodyguard, which means your models within 2 have cover. So you have to do a lot of fiddling where you want to be inside 2, outside 1, so that you aren't getting Black Blood pinged on you. And while that's perfectly fine and easy to do in games where you're playing fresh, like turn 1, turn 2, that's fine. You start getting into turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, you're thinking about other things than where is Grave exactly outside of 1 inch of all of my models. And you can just have a really bad turn if you make that mistake.
Would you take him for keeping the peace in crews that have models that do multiple charges, or in a crew like Anya where she wants to jump next to you, charge through you, and do a lot of damage? Because he's kind of, like you said, his abilities kind of reinforce the bubble, but he's a bit of a detriment while in that bubble. So,
well, that's where Tannen comes into play.
Exactly. If they're already in your bubble, you have enough other stuff that you don't mind. And then also he feels like he's overlapping that beater slot where he's not tanky, but he's trying to do damage. And like you could have either Gwyneth, who we mentioned, even though I'm not a fan, I'd still take her before I took Graves, or you can take the Shadow Emissary. And Lead the Way might seem attractive as an unpacking tool, but you have to understand very frequently if you're using Lead the Way, either Graves is going to be in the way of someone else while trying to unpack, or someone else will be in the way of Graves. So if you push your model 4 and you can't push Graves out to meet that model, you essentially spent a 6 and an AP to just take a walk on someone, or less than a walk on someone else. And this more expensive model that you spent, more stones on is now stuck in your deployment zone blocking everyone else. So he's just a really awkward model to use for his price. He doesn't quite take hits well enough to be a beater. He doesn't move well enough to interact meaningfully with your opponent. And inside the bubble, if you're not paying attention, he does a lot more to hurt you than just to help you.
And I tend to agree. If Weird's listening, I think they could dramatically improve Mr. Graves by getting rid of his tactical action, giving him a new one, I don't care what it is, and then giving him the anti-charge where you cannot resolve
Extended
actions
reach.
generate. Exactly. I think that would make Graves where he actually is useful to the crew.
If he also just had better triggers on his fence post, that might also help. Severe injury is great, but no triggers built in, and puncture's on a 3-4-5 track.
It was funny because you're like, I see him dropped a lot. I'm like, oh, you mean with guns?
Yeah,
Nope,
I mean,
on his head.
I feel like extended reach would be better. Like swap bodyguard out, take extended reach. All that from a card space perspective, that probably fit. But
Well,
that seems like it'd be less fiddly.
Swap
I could see him.
out.
I could see him coming in crews that rely on terrifying and manipulative a lot because he does have ruthless and he does have a good damage track of 3-4-5. But
See, I've tried that, and the problem with that is he doesn't have the movement to get to the targets he needs to hit. So like models with a manipulative you might be trying to ignore tend to be in the back line, right? And Graves is once again walk 5, no movement tech. And so if it takes him 3 turns to get next to the thing that he's supposed to be hitting, and that's what you hired him for, like that's the ideal scenario. Like sometimes he might not be getting engaged with whatever you've hired him to fight until like turn 4, and then he's not affecting the game state. And so his problem is just he's slow.
Yeah, I mean, and once again, I agree with you. Just doing the devil's advocate, there are models where they can make him not slow, but there's better models that like for Beckoners.
Thunders does not hurt for Ruthless at all.
Yeah, well, some of us do. Some of us all can't have massive, awesome, good upgrades. Okay.
Hey, I would tell you.
You play Explorer Society, Jeff.
Yeah, you have fantastic upgrades.
I'll get blamed for this, but I think Thunders are like 3rd or 4th on the upgrade, handout list, which is middle of the pack at this point in time.
I played Neverborn before that, and their upgrades are genuinely not very good.
Yeah, Outcast would like to have a
word with that. Ancient Pact is phenomenal, and Blade Rush is good. And GG0 Nephilim also got Butterfly Jump, so I don't want to hear it.
Yeah, that was the last time you played Nephilim on a regular basis, so yeah.
I have to say I am not and I know Andre Dimmings is going to throw something at the phone right now. I'm not a fan of Nephilim in the least. They're just not my flavor. I don't think they're all that great, and the grow mechanic is just stupid. But that's a different podcast.
Oof. Have you tried it with Candy? Candy is the secret sauce.
I love Candy, and I mentioned I mentioned not just because I'm fat, but I mentioned that in the Third Floor Wars, I did their Pandora episode, and I talk about all my raving awesomeness of how good Candy is.
You should have opened with the "I Love Candy" song, but yeah. So one other question, before we go to the break, Illuminated. You mentioned them in passing about, hey, if you can summon one, that's awesome because they're pretty cool. And I mean, they seem like sort of mini beaters that have some good stuff going for them. Do you ever hire them, or are they just a situational bonus?
Yeah, like if I look at my list and I'm accomplishing all the objectives I want to do with my list building, and I see I've got like 10, 12 stones left over, I'll hire Illuminated. They have a lot of good stuff going on in the card. I know you called them a beat stick, but honestly, the thing I love most about them is their Shockwave, which might be controversial because people hate Shockwaves, but it's a good TN, it does good damage, it puts out Brilliance tokens, and it's against willpower. which is one of the lesser stats that shockwaves tend to hit. And if you've got something like a Kabuki, as I mentioned, that can be on an egg flip, and that starts to be huge when you're throwing out shockwaves on multiple models on an egg flip.
And you have the added benefit of a lot of people when you start stacking shockwaves, it depletes your opponent's hand, but it usually depletes yours as well because usually in the earlier models, the shockwaves had high target numbers that they had to hit, usually like 7s and 8s in order to get a shockwave off. But the Illuminated only needs a 6 to do it, and with Lynch, his whole crew with Rig the Deck, it's not really hard things for them to do.
Yeah, the first one's free. And if it's not, you've got Brill Shaper to also just filter a bad card off the top of your deck, which is really helpful. And then they're just really good in melee with essentially a trigger that makes them built-in min 3, max 6. So like, no, these are excellent models. I try to hire one when I have space, but they're never top of the list, if that makes sense. And they don't have the greatest defensive tech in the world, so they'll drop. But if I've got the stones, I like to hire them.
That's actually, this hasn't been mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned it. A lot of your models have these little, like Brill Shaper, keeping the peace. They have these little bonus actions that they can use, and I think that's by design so that when you're using Rig the Deck, you can just use like this throwaway ability that doesn't really do anything for you right now, but it's just to get rid of that bad card that you put there.
Exactly. And between that and like intentionally targeting your own models to get through bad cards, there's a lot of skill cap that you can just unlock that makes playing the crew really fun. Even if you're not winning, you like might discover a new trick, or you can be like, yeah, I did this really cool play with my cards. That just really adds to the enjoyment of the crew.
Awesome.
Cool. So we're gonna go to another break, and when we get back, we're gonna wrap up with counterplay. What should people be doing against Lynch? When would you not take Lynch? And so we'll help out those folks who are facing off. So stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So we're going to talk a little bit about counterplay, throw a bone to those of you who are facing off against Lynch. So Landon, if you've got Lynch, what are like the top 3 things you don't want your opponent to do?
Shoot him. Please don't shoot me. Don't shoot me. Don't take plus flips. Those are the things that absolutely terrify me. As we mentioned when we were talking about Tannen, if your opponent can meaningfully interact with you from outside 6, Bubble Lynch just stops working very well. Bonus points if you have ways to get around like Lynch's defensive tech, which is the very short list of if you have Brilliance, you get an egg flip when you attack me. So whether it's easy focus or like built-in plus flips, that makes Lynch cry a little bit. You get a little bit of around that with Gwyneth, who has Luck Thief, where plus flips are bad. So the other thing you don't want to see in Lynch is injured, where Luck Thief only helps so much if Gwyneth is like a stat 4 or 3 on her defense duels. Doesn't matter if you're on an egg flip, you can still hit those sometimes, or if you're just taking min 3 shots enough times at a straight on min 3, like she just kind of drops. So injured, plus flips, guns, all bad for Lynch.
So kind of to that point though is you know this. You know that you don't like being shot at. So you're taking in specific models in order to counter that, like the Shadow Emissary.
Right.
So your opponent's got to know that. So it's one of those things where you know that they know that you know that they know that they know that you know. So it's not just that your opponent.
Can you repeat that again?
I believe it went something like "fuck you."
Okay, good enough.
So it's not just enough to take guns, but you have to take like guns that get around concealment, things like that as well. Correct?
Yeah, sometimes. One of the reasons I do like the Emissary is because you can put out that concealing bubble for your early turns to try and stop you from being shot. And sometimes guns that ignore concealment or plus flips are really good, but like you have Gwyneth to help mitigate that a little bit if you want to lean into that angle. But one of the other things I would say is a kind of a helpful generic thing to take in the Lynch is Ruthless. A lot of the ways he gets Brilliance tokens out honestly comes from the front of his ability card, which apologies if you're a new player playing Lynch, you'll miss this. When your opponent flips an ace, they get a Brilliance token. And that's just like a hard period fact that it happens, and you need to be watching their deck to make sure it happens. In Vassal, it's a lot easier because you can look through the discard. You can like see your opponent's cards at all time. In person, there's some amount of grace and like it that you need to get from your opponent where they have to kind of help you out, help them out, because otherwise you're just like leaning over the table the whole game and not actually playing Malifaux. But it is probably the biggest way you get Brilliance tokens out, and so tiny little duels like Terrifying, even if they're not high TNs, are one of the things that drives that. So having Ruthless models to get around Huggies Terrifying, or the Emissaries Terrifying, or the Illuminates Terrifying just helps stem the flow of Brilliance a little bit.
What are my what are you, God, I don't want to make the linchpin joke. What are the linchpin models in your crew? Who should I try to kill first?
So
God, that got really depressing.
the best and the worst answer for this is the Hungering Darkness. The Hungering Darkness is a really important model to the crew, and if you can get rid of the Hungering Darkness, it's great. He's also the hardest model in the crew to kill. He's got Terrifying, he's got Incorporeal, and more than all of that, he's got a bonus action where he just heals based on however many models, yours and mine, within 6 inches of him have Brilliance. No card flips involved, so sometimes he'll just like bonus action heal 6 on top of having Soul Stones. But if you can manage to remove him, say like he activated early in a turn and is sitting in a really dumb spot, removing him's a great idea. If you can't remove him, don't touch him.
Is this something that in my crew I need to dedicate tech towards? Things that are irreducible damage, things that kind of prevent that Incorporeal and Soul Stones to happen?
So like Ruthless is a really helpful thing because he's Terrifying 11. And then just having Min 3 from there or better, or ignoring Incorporeal or something, also really helps. But even more than all of that, if you can just find something that shuts off healing and Soul Stones, that also really makes Huggy a very sad looking model. And can really make it a very difficult take into certain factions.
Well, to be fair, his original model of the decrepit tadpole was kind of a sad-looking model to begin with.
Hey, I like my purple translucent 2nd edition Huggy, but I can understand where he does not look very great if you can actually make out his features.
And then they made an awesome Huggy model, but then made it way too big.
Yeah, the elephant tentacle beast. Yeah, that model's cool. I wish I had
The
one.
monster from Stranger Things, you mean?
So is his models like porridge, where one was too small, one was too big, and the next one's just right?
Pretty much.
I don't really like the M3 one all too much, so I don't know if I could call it porridge, but the size is probably correct.
Does not have a mold line the size of a small model.
Yes.
So I'm curious, when you're playing your bubble version, what's the most interesting way that an opponent has gotten out of the bubble?
The most interesting way an opponent has gotten out of the bubble. I'm trying to think. I don't know if it's all too interesting, but Tara just unburying her models that get put in the bubble was pretty neat. I don't play the bubble style all too often, but when I do, usually it's because I know my opponent's going to be stuck in it.
Neverborn and Resurrectionists?
Pretty much.
All right. Do you have any other counters that you'd like to bring up aside from shoot him in the face?
Let's see now. Aside from shoot him in the face and make sure that you can potentially kill Huggy being good ways to deal with the counter on Lynch.
How about versus the Obey, right? Like, so a lot of your playstyle revolves around Obey as a way to either score points or pull your opponent off of points. Are there things like sometimes if I'm playing like ley lines, I will often try to activate the model with the lodestone as late as possible to minimize the abilities that my opponent can try to do to move them off. Are there things like that that can help try to mitigate the Obey?
Having stuff like Laugh Off or Planted Roots, not necessarily for the Obey specifically, but against the crew can be pretty nasty. because a lot of the movement also will just come from like lures on beckoners. So if you have ways to stop yourself from being pulled into the bubble, that can be pretty helpful too. I know one of my first games of GG1, I was really excited. I looked at all the strategies. And I'm like, yeah, Lynch is great at all these strategies. And I played my first game of Corrupted Leylines against Titania, and she just had, I think, like 2 Waldgeists. I looked at my list where I was trying to lure things off the ley lines. I looked at his list and I went, this doesn't work, does it? And then he said, no, drop Titania in my safes and plus flip through all my defenses, and I died. It was a very sad game.
Yeah, I mean, with Guild, it made me think of like the crowd control on the Brutal Emissary.
Yeah, that would work. But yeah, generally, if you can get through the plus flip defenses, lots of the crew goes down very quickly. And if you can turn off the primary shtick of moving your models around, then what are they even doing?
All right. Well, to move off of Lynch, harkening back to when Jamie Varney was on the podcast, apparently I'm playing the pantomime villain within the United States. And you mentioned that there was a post that was made on a Weird Place that riled you up a little bit. Did you want to get into that?
Feel free to burst his meat bubble.
I have no fucking clue how you can think that Vengeance and We Are Legion are comparable abilities. Like, I don't know how you can read one and then read the other and say these do the same thing.
Well,
like,
to be
except
fair,
worse, because Vengeance always works, and I don't even know where to start.
Wait. So to clarify the take, are you saying? So, vaguely paraphrasing here. So Jeff had stirred the pot a bit on the Cadmus hate train, and so somewhere in that conversation, he said, the We Are Legion damage ping is similar to Vengeance. Would you say that does Vengeance dirty and Vengeance is actually way better, or that is underselling the power of We Are Legion?
So not only is that underselling the power of We Are Legion, that is obtusely missing the point of what We Are Legion can do as an ability by like restricting it to a very narrow case where you're very often not even using it that way.
So I understand what you're saying, but it just in a nutshell.
But Jeff disagrees.
No, I do, and I'll explain why. In a nutshell, if you just take the 2 abilities as they are, We Are Legion is melee based. You have to be within 2 inches, 3. I don't remember.
You have to be within 4 inches of a model that is within 4 inches of a model that is within 4 inches of your model. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes, if you want to pass it off to your own. But I'm just the damage to you. I'm not getting into passing off. I had equated it to the equivalent of incorporeal and vengeance, which incorporeal reduces the damage by 1, which is essentially what you're doing with We Are Legion. And you are, in some cases, returning that damage, which is also something that vengeance does. Now, We Are Legion has to be set up with a parasite token on a model that's close by, and it is only melee based. Well, 4 inch. The model has to be close enough for you to actually pass the damage onto. Now, I understand why some people got upset about that, but I also think that when people complain about Cadmus, they are not complaining about necessarily Cadmus itself. They are complaining about the other models that are taken with Cadmus, such as the admittedly broken Intrepid Emissary.
I'll stop you and disagree with you right there, because I don't think the Emissary is even used in the most broken Cadmus builds, which also is part of my complaint. But you can continue your point.
Please continue telling him he's wrong.
Yeah, that is the gist of my point of that. Between Incorporeal and Vengeance and a summoning crew, I think that the 2 are comparable.
So when was the last time you took your Incorporeal Vengeance model and hit another one of your Incorporeal Vengeance models? When was the last time a Seishin just like hit Datsuba and did a point of damage across the board to something 20 inches away? Now, last I checked, Karai can't do that.
Now, you bring up a good point of passing off damage when you hurt your own models. And that is a tactic that the crew has. However, in order to get that tactic off, if you notice, almost all of the models in the Cadmus crew all do low damage with the exception of the Archivist. Like, they are all very low damage tracks, and that's your trade-off. They don't have Seishin that are doing, what is it, 2, 3, 6 or something like that.
Okay, so a Seishin is the 2-stone model in Karai that I think just pushes things along.
Sorry, Shikome. It's Shikome. 2, 3, 6, is it?
Yeah, something like that.
So,
I mean, is 2, 3, 6 significantly different from 2, 3, 5?
Well, yes, but
No.
yes.
No.
All right, no, but I don't think, in general, I don't think people are complaining about the Berserker Husks damage track. It's the auto damage that gets, and I think that's where people are getting a little upset, is the auto damage that happens.
You're absolutely true, but you also seem to be discounting that at every step of our conversation as like the degenerate part of Cadmus.
I still stick by if some of the other models, and maybe Cadmus.
So I'll stop you right here because you're going to deflect from the models, but I'll tell you right now, the problem models in my mind are Cryptologists, Meredith, and Berserker Husks, because that's the core of what makes Cadmus a problem. The fact that you can put 18 stones of models on the table in a turn, every turn, until the end of the game, so long as your Berserker Husks, aren't on the table at the end of any given turn. And if they are, well, you're playing 18 stones up to begin with, of models that don't meaningfully interact with your opponent in any way that they can affect. And they just have to accept that they're eating buckets of damage every turn, because they can't even get rid of these models because you summon them right back.
And to be fair, we actually highlighted the Cryptologist, and I don't know that anyone was doing that before we talked about the Cryptologist being able to do that multiple times per turn.
Well, we were doing that before you guys talked about it, but
aside from that,
mic drop.
This is the first time that I've heard this as a complaint. When I went in the thread, I saw a lot of Intrepid Emissary, and some people also mentioned
Nagatoro,
yeah,
no, that's because they're just looking at Plog's games, and Plog is a reasonable player. I don't think he's a great list builder, and they're just playing like the cookie cutter. This is, I read the cards first time. This is the list I'm going to take because it's obvious synergy stuff. And
so I since you brought this up, I actually agree with your take here, and I think the Cryptologist should probably be limited to Wastrel only with that ability. And if that were to happen in an errata, would you feel that would bring things more in line? And then some emissary changes.
I'm going to level with you. Myself and my friend who actually play Cadmus, we don't think Cadmus is the boogeyman that the community thinks it is. But by no means is it like at an acceptable power level if everything gets tuned downwards. Like, saying it's balanced because Shtuk is balanced isn't a good indicator that the game's in a good place, because nobody thinks Shtuk's balanced.
Okay, and I agree with you there. I think Cadmus is at a higher end power level. I don't think people were saying that he is completely unbeatable, or Nexus in general is just completely unbeatable and is a powerhouse and is going to ruin the game. And I can agree with that. There needs to be a couple of tweaks, but I think he's at the same power level as things like Leviticus, Von Shtuk. I got to think of.
I think Levy is on the balanced end of broken, not the broken end of broken.
Wasn't our literal motto on this podcast "Nerf Leviticus"?
It was indeed.
It was.
And now you're literally standing him up as the pinnacle of, oh, this is fine.
Hold on. At no point in time have I said that I don't think Cadmus should be.
I said Leviticus was fine. Leave Leviticus alone.
You notice this. The Leviticus player thinks Levy's fine. The Cadmus player thinks Cadmus is fine.
I don't think
the player is asking for buffs.
I don't actually think that Cadmus. I think that Cadmus, within his own keyword, if you do not go outside of his keyword, plays as intended and is at a good power level. Going outside of his keyword, exactly. I think the problem is when you bring the other models in that alter the power level of the crew and make things problematic.
Saying in a vacuum something exists and is fine is only true if you're in a vacuum. And that's just not how things work.
That's true.
All right. Owen, the moderator, has said that we need to wrap this up, so we should probably do that.
That's fair.
That
My
is
one
fair.
plug for the day: Dead Rider is not fine in a vacuum, and he's not fine in the environment he exists. Fuck that model. I hope it's gone.
I would retort that Dead Rider is fine in a vacuum because he's dead, and the lack of oxygen won't hurt him.
There we go.
Pedantic Josh is pedantic.
There's the pedantic take.
Not at my best today, but I'll bring a little bit of pedantry right at the end so as to not disappoint the audience.
There we go. That's what you heard it here, folks. That's what we're here for. All right. Well, so Landon, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll definitely have you back for a future episode. Until next time, play some foe. Let us know in the comments what you think, what you'd like to hear about, and we will see you on the next episode of Capital City Crew Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Capital City Crew Podcast. We hope you tune in next time.